All right, now I apologize because this presentation is meant for someone who doesn't know very much about chestnut trees. I know a lot of you know a lot about chestnut trees, but I'll try to go through it pretty quickly here. I've had different names for this lecture. It could be Chestnut 101, everything you want to know. And it's had to change a lot recently because the science has changed a lot recently. So there's the latest title slide. If you talk to other people about chestnut trees, you might be talking to them about something else called the horse chestnut, which we still get tree leads from people who report chestnuts, and it's not even the same species, but I don't think I have to explain that to anyone in this room. So we're not talking about that chestnut. We are talking about, the great, by the way, I can't make too much of a joke of this because this is how I got into chestnut. I thought I found something really awesome. I found a horse chestnut, and I thought you could eat it, it was great, it was rare, and then I found out how wrong I was. And here I am, 25 years later. So I actually had to go to a library and find out things about the organization. I found an article in National Geographic about this new group that was starting up chestnut restoration with Phil Rudder, and it was very exciting to me. And then my first child was born, and I really couldn't do too much. But just as far as we all know what we're looking at here, this is American chestnut down on the right, but other things do look a lot like it, like beech trees, and of course Chinese chestnut trees, and sawtooth oak and chestnut oak. They're all members of the Fagaceae family, they're the beech family, so it makes sense that they all look similar. And but we're of course interested in that amazing tree that was made up quite a large portion of the forest, 125 years ago. And you have to do a little bit of imagination, but try to imagine yourself, before European contact in the eastern United States. There are wolves running around, and mountain lions, and passenger pigeons, and there are 4 billion chestnut trees, and there are only 5 million Homo sapiens in all of the Americas. That's, much less than the state of Massachusetts, all the Americas. So things were a little different. And this is the, the traditional range map we show of the chestnut tree, from Mississippi practically up to Maine, and a lot of people think there aren't as many chestnuts down in the sort of southeast because ink disease actually might have taken some of them early on. But anyway, we'll get to that later. Oh yeah, you are here. So you all know we would have been covered with ice, right? 10 or 15,000 years ago. All the tree species had to move south and hide out in refugia down in Florida and the Panhandle. And the chestnut, I think, hid out down in Alabama and Florida, and then it slowly made its way back up as the glaciation receded. And the interesting thing is sort of Native Americans and chestnut trees almost simultaneously repopulated the eastern forest. The chestnut tree was one of the last hardwoods to sort of make its way back up the coast. If you don't know anything about chestnut and you haven't sort of experienced the life cycle, I know it seems obvious, but I'm just going to go through it quickly because it's pretty amazing. You have the little nut there that everyone wants to eat, and all the genes are tied up in there, and hopefully a squirrel buries it and then forgets about it, and next year it can, or in the spring it can, in the spring it can start, in the spring it can start growing. And the nice thing about chestnut tree is, no matter what the climate happens to be that year, it's pretty good at producing a lot of nuts, and some trees can produce 5,000 nuts in a season. And then the nut has to go to sleep for a while, called stratification, where and that's how it knows that it should grow in the spring, and it has its own antifreeze system, and it's pretty amazing. It can't get too cold, but if it stays at, it has to be, it has to be close to freezing for like 20 or 30 days, and then you'll get the result that you want. And then in the spring, this weird little thing comes out of the nut called the radicle, which is the beginning of the root system, and then this amazing little leaves come out of the nut, and it's a pretty amazing thing. And then you get a seedling as long as everything is, nothing's eaten it, and you have to watch out because sometimes the nut stays attached to the seedling, and then the animals get the nut and they rip up the seedling. And if all goes well, then you might turn into a sapling, and in 1 to 20 years, you'll probably grow around here until you die from the chestnut blight, which we're going to talk about. And of course, a lot of animals like to eat the tree and destroy and eat the trees, which is kind of strange. Then if you're lucky enough to grow up into a tree, you've got to be next to another chestnut tree that happens to be flowering. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry about that. Don't know. this is going to be, sorry. Went through, I'm not used to using my iPad here to present. There we go. Okay, I'm back. Then you have to be lucky enough to be next to another tree that's flowering, and that happens usually at the beginning of July. Always by July 4th there seem to be flowers, sometimes earlier. And then this amazing little pollen grain goes flying from one tree to another and starts the process of making 2 or 3 new nuts in that little green spiny thing that eventually becomes the burr. So it's a pretty amazing process. And then of course, if they make it through the summer, we can harvest in late September and October. So that's the life cycle, which you all know about. And of course, the effect on the natural environment is pretty amazing. All those nice little creatures, deer, bear, foxes, voles, moles, squirrels, blue jays, turkeys, they all like to eat the chestnuts, and that helps them grow and prosper. And then, as I already said, Native American people seem to use the chestnut pretty heavily. They used it for their houses. They used it for food source. They kept it underground and made so they could have snacks in the winter. And they used the leaves for medicine. And of course, they made dugout canoes. So it was a great, important species for them. And then when Europeans showed up, they also realized how great the tree was, and they could log it and they could work it. And actually the nice thing is it would regrow from the stump sprouts, so you didn't have to like replant anything. You could go back and get some more lumber in 10 or 20 years. And it was a pretty big building material, great for, as most of you know, the chestnut it's light and it's rot resistant and fairly easy to work. So it was good for fencing, it was good for shingles, and it was also good for furniture. These are just some examples. And it was also, the bark is acidic enough that it was used for, they extracted the tannin for I think which was for leather processing, but that was a big thing in the South, taking chestnut logs and extracting the tannin from it. And they're also used for utility poles, and there's roofing over on the right there with a chestnut utility pole that's still in use today. So it's coming up on getting close to, 90 years. And we've kind of lost a lot of the chestnut culture now because of the blight. People used to, in the fall, look forward to buying chestnuts, roasted chestnuts in the city. Kids and lovers used to go out and go chestnutting in the fall, and it was a nice little activity. Some of us still do that. And in other parts of the country too, it was used for fattening up all your cattle and your pigs before you were going to drive them in to have them slaughtered. And I know in the South a lot of people sold the chestnuts and made extra money to buy shoes and other things that were pretty important. And then of course we all know that in 1904 people noticed that some of the chestnut trees at the New York Botanical Garden in Bronx were looking sickly. They had some kind of bark disease, and then the whole thing started rolling. And within about 50 years, almost every single chestnut tree in the United States was completely attacked by this blight, which they weren't really sure of what it was, but it's really just a fungus. So it's a fungus that was imported from Asia on probably nursery rootstock back in the late 1800s, and there's, if you like the Latin name, what it does is it causes a canker on the bark, and you can see it sinks in, and eventually it goes around the entire tree, and it girdles the tree, and it dies. So that's what we've been dealing with for a while now. In fact, I know we're outside in the parking lot, we have some of these. Chestnut is still not extinct because it can re-sprout from the root collar, so it's kind of functionally extinct. It doesn't ever, or generally it doesn't grow big enough to have flower and be near another chestnut and have nuts, so it's hard for it to fight back and try to deal with this. So that's sort of what chestnuts look like around here, generally. And a long time ago I was confused by this, but then it made a lot of sense. Trees go back, 370 million years ago, and the continents were all connected, and that's where the trees started. But then as the continents started separating, of course the American chestnut got further and further away from what eventually would be any chance to get resistance from dealing with the blight. So these are where the major type of chestnuts are in the world today. And it makes sense that You know, Japanese and Chinese chestnuts are pretty resistant, European a little bit, at least they're on the same continent, but Americans really didn't seem to have any resistance. Early scientists tried to deal with the problem by making hybrids, because they knew Chinese trees were fairly resistant, and they did some hybrids and they had some success, but they never really went too far with it. They didn't do different generations, and they tried almost everything they could to stop the blight. They cut down forests, they buried trees, they sprayed foam, they tried everything, and nothing really seemed to keep the blight at bay. And none of these new varieties seem to be much like the old American chestnut. So then, in the early 80s, there was a plan by a corn geneticist named Charles Burnham he thought that there should be, if you know your elementary biology, and even I took biology in 9th grade, you can get traits from one tree into another tree if you backcross them and you select for what you want. And that's really what the American Chestnut Foundation has been doing for, 35 years. And I'll show you the chart later that we always show. But basically it's called the backcross method. And you keep trying to dilute the traits you don't want and confer the traits that you do want.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Siri wants to talk to you. Quiet, Siri. All right, technology. This is the chart that we always used to show, where you start off with a tree up at the top left there that's sort of half red, half wet, half Chinese, half American, and you keep back crossing every generation American trees, and by the end you get down to a tree that was mostly American, and hopefully would have mostly American traits and that Chinese blight resistance. And this is all built on the model that there were probably 3 genes at work, and this would be enough generations. So that's kind of where we are now at the bottom of that chart. And then every generation, though, it looks great to see on a chart, but actually to do that is 7 or 8 years of growing the tree, collecting the nuts, and then you actually inoculate the tree with the blight and see how it responds. So it looks easy on paper, but that's a lot of work to get down to that last step. And we didn't really have a great way of telling whether we had a Labrador or a poodle for a long time, which we now sort of have a better method. Here's the same thing. We're basically at the lowest stage here, and once the organization started getting those trees, started testing them out, and they didn't exactly seem to respond the way we had hoped. We basically used a lot of somewhat subjective criteria to try to figure out whether trees were resistant or not. Canker size and severity. A lot of times in an orchard, the blight will just kill the tree outright. That's not a good one. And then we're trying to figure out the Americanness by different types, observable types like the leaf shape and the bud break and stems and all that kind of thing. But as it turns out, whatever we were doing, it wasn't quite precise enough. And while this has been going on in the last 10 or 20 years, the sort of science of genetics has expanded, and the Chinese chestnut genome, there was a project that started to sequence part of it and map it out. And then I know Paul will probably talk about this later, but it's now actually, we can accurately tell sort of how much Americanness and Chinese there is in our trees. And if we have enough money to send them off to be tested, that's another thing. And we're trying to figure out easier ways of doing this, like small stem assays, or just little tests that you do on the leaf when they're pretty young, and then you don't even have to plant the seedling. You can get rid of the ones that aren't good early. But that's sort of what's happened very recently. And once at Meadowview, they started to test the BC3F3, so the trees at the lowest end of the breeding chart there. They noticed that a lot of them had more Chinese than expected, and they had less resistance than they expected, which a lot of people I know, some people in this room, had been noticing for a long time. And the genetic analysis suggests that there's far more than 3 genes, maybe 9 genes controlling blight resistance. So that original chart that we started off with 35 years ago, we might have to modify, and it's good that we have Paul here to explain what we should do. But the TACF sort of knew. I think they knew that the breeding program might not work the way it was constructed, and even a few years ago, they came up with a 3-burr approach. that breeding would be one thing, biotechnology would be another thing, and biocontrol. And you know, it might take multiple pathways to get this tree back in the forest. And so there was still a lot of emphasis on backcross breeding and conserving germplasm and trying different studies and getting more Chinese resistance. But the big new thing, and it's, you know, can be controversial, but it doesn't seem as controversial. There's a transgenic tree out there now, which is a possibility. And biocontrol has always been around. They've discovered that viruses can attack the fungus, and so that makes it weaker. So some viruses actually are really good at sort of containing the fungus, and I know people are looking for the best versions of those that help weaken the blight. So, what is a transgenic tree? It is Bill Powell at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry has been working on this for over 10 years, I know, trying to get one gene into a tree that would actually grow. And I have to apologize. I apologize for this slide. I know it's too much information, and but these are just some of my notes that Brian gave to me. But they have to remove the germ cell from the nut. Then they have to get the material into the nut, but they actually use bacteria to do that. So it's sort of a natural process. And then they're trying to insert one gene from wheat. And it's an antifungal gene, which would make sense with a fungus, fighting a fungus. And it's sort of a natural process, but it's this process, they really took them a long time to get it so it would even work. And even when they, apparently chestnut is much harder to work with than other trees and plants they had worked with, and even when they got the gene in, it kind of shows up randomly, and they had to wait until they got the gene in the right place that wouldn't destroy other important genes and also would express well and continue on. So I know Brian and Paul can explain this much better than I can, but it took thousands of attempts to try to get one event for one of these trees to work. So most of them, I think, is one event that they're working with that tree, and they can actually grow it, but it takes 3 years. Here's a nice little, I stole this from their presentation, but here's a nice little slide there. So that gene helps the chestnut degrade the oxalic acid that tends to, attack the tree. And I haven't tried to balance an equation in a long time, so I'm not going to look at that. Any of you chemists out there? Looks pretty simple, right? But a transgenic chestnut is not a magical solution. I mean, it's great if it works, but so far, as I said, all the trees are really from one event, so that's like a clone, and they make clones of that one tree, and it takes almost 3 years to go through the process, and has to go through some regulating agencies, and individual chapters are going to have to decide whether they want to participate or not in that part of the program. And just the one kind of hopeful thing is if this does work, a transgenic tree crossed with an American, 50% of the progeny should get the gene. So you could quickly turn around an ecosystem to get that gene. I mean, it's a good thing or a scary thing, depending on which side you're on. So the question is, what do we do now? We've sort of reached the bottom of that chart, and how do we continue all that work, all that time we spent up in bucket trucks in the middle of the summer trying to pollinate with little tiny, how do we keep this going with all this new information? And fortunately, we have two nice people who are going to tell us about that. Brian is going to explain to us what we're going to do with our orchards and what we actually have in our orchards. And then Paul's going to go beyond the Burnham plan. So that's the big event. What do we do after this if it's more than 3 genes? And I just hope those trees that we've saved over the years can still remain in our program, like the Quabbin tree, which Rufin and I were involved with a long time ago. So we're obviously trying to do this for Mass and Rhode Island, and we've spent 20 years making these orchards, growing trees and killing them to select them for the next step. So we all have a lot invested in those orchards. And then I'm not even going to touch on Phytophthora, which is the disease that actually attacks the roots of the tree, which is really lethal. Mostly at first it was in the southern part of the US, but fortunately I think it seems like the American chestnuts have some resistance, so if you pick the right lines, you'll also can get around the ink disease eventually. That's another thing that everything's being tested for now. If we're only worried about gall wasp, we're in a good place. We don't have to worry. Or chestnut weevil means we've done our job. So just again, imagine. Try to imagine. Even if we had a perfect tree, like if I said we had perfect nuts over there, just what a job it would be to actually reforest the part of the country that has lost the chestnuts. It's a multi-generational, 100 years project. I even saw someone try to estimate how much work would be involved in just trying to get some of the chestnut habitat back. It would be hard. And we don't really know how our trees or any tree performs in forest situations for a long time, sometimes hundreds of years. And most of us don't live hundreds of years. And we also don't know what other threats might come. So that, I think, that's a real quick sort of the latest update on chestnut. And we do have, we have a website which you can go to there, or you can go to the national site. And we do have a Twitter, which we will try to post more things on. We do have a Facebook. We have 2 Facebooks. One we can't get rid of, but the other one is there. So that's the latest on chestnut.
Thank you. Questions? No questions for Brad?
Okay, one question. Where at Quabbin is the tree that you were talking about?
It was on the Prescott Peninsula on the western side, about 2/3 of the way down, but it's since been nicked by a logging truck and it's dead. Often, a lot of the trees that we collected the pollen from die within a year or 2 because they get released for some reason, or it's a development. So, very few of the trees that we actually have the pollen from are still living. Like we can still get them. Because we tend to get them right before in their death throes when they're trying to throw off flowers. And
I was out there in October, and I was leading a hike into Gate 8, and I must have seen well over 100 chestnuts on that one road to Gate 8 fishing area. I've also seen a lot in North Prescott, New Salem, and Dana too.
yeah, they're all over. The main thing is we need to find 2 that are big enough and flowering near each other, and then they could actually try to make their own nuts instead of having us do all the work for them.
Any other questions?
Yes, you said that you originally got interested because you found what you thought was chestnut.
Yeah, exactly.
And I presume you didn't eat it because you're still here.
I actually put it in my microwave and tried to heat it and tasted it, and it was pretty bitter. And then I had an argument with my sister-in-law, and she was right. That made me really mad. So I had to become more, at least a little more versed in it. Yes.
Are chestnuts shade tolerant enough to be easily reintroduced to a forest and they get up to the canopy?
They have to be released, but they'll stay in below forever. And then they get an opportunity from something else, and then they sprout up. They stay low. They're basically like a shrub net. It just keeps growing up and dying back. Well, there's a lot more information coming.
Any other questions? So there are other opportunities to ask questions here. So we're going to move on and talk a little bit about what's going on in the chapter and the details of the work we've done